My name is Rachel Anderson, and I am 38 years old. When people look at me now, they see a polished figure in a black robe, a woman who walks the halls of justice with certainty. What they don't see are the years of doubt, the nights spent alone with law books for company, or the battles I fought long before stepping into a courtroom. I live in Washington, D.C., in a townhouse not far from the Capitol. Each morning I wake before sunrise, brew a strong cup of coffee, and review the day's briefs as the city slowly comes to life. To most, this may seem ordinary. But to me, every page of law, every case file, is a reminder that the law gave me a second chance when life tried to take everything from me. My colleagues describe me as disciplined, relentless, even unyielding. Perhaps they are right. Discipline is not something I was born with, it was forged. Every setback shaped me. Every disappointment carved a piece of resolve I never knew I had. There was a time when I thought my life would follow a different path, a quieter one, filled with partnership and shared victories. Instead, I learned how easily admiration can turn into rivalry, how quickly promises can twist into chains. I rarely speak of that part of my life. Even now, standing where I stand, it is easier to hide it behind silence. But it exists, tucked into the edges of my story like a shadow trailing close behind. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is this: shadows have a way of catching up to you, no matter how far you climb. I was 22 when I first stepped into the Grand Lecture Hall at Harvard Law School. The walls smelled of old wood and ink, and the professors carried themselves like guardians of a secret world. I remember clutching my notebook so tightly my fingers ached, determined to prove I belonged there. That's when I noticed him, Victor Hale. He had the kind of presence that made people turn their heads. Confident, polished, quick with answers. He was the student who always had his hand raised, and more often than not, the professors nodded with approval. At first, I admired him. I admired the way he could debate with sharp precision, the way he quoted precedent as if it were poetry. He noticed me too, the quiet girl who studied late at the library and never missed a deadline. We were opposites in style but equals in drive. It started with study sessions. Victor and I spent long evenings buried in case law, coffee cups scattered across the table, our laughter echoing through empty halls. He told me once, "Rachel, one day we'll be a team no one can ignore." At the time, I believed him. After graduation, we both passed the bar and joined respected firms in New York City. Life was fast, the hours brutal, but together we thrived. We moved into a small apartment with more books than furniture, and for a while, it felt like we were unstoppable. In courtrooms, we became known as a power couple. He handled clients with charm, I dissected arguments with logic. Judges remembered us. Opposing counsel whispered our names with a mix of respect and envy. And when Victor proposed to me at the steps of the courthouse where we had just won a case, I thought I was saying yes to a partner in both life and law. But marriage has a way of revealing truths that law school never teaches. At first, it was subtle, small remarks about how I spoke too much in meetings, how I was lucky when I won a case. I brushed it off as stress, as pride. I told myself that once he saw how strong we could be together, the doubts would fade. What I didn't realize then was that envy doesn't fade. It grows quietly, waiting for its moment to strike. Marriage, for us, began like a carefully drafted contract, full of promise, ambition, and faith in the future. But unlike the law, marriage doesn't follow precedent. It bends under the weight of pride. It fractures in silence. Victor's jealousy first showed itself in small cracks. He would come home late and toss his briefcase onto the couch, asking casually how my day went. If I mentioned a courtroom victory, his jaw would tighten. "You got lucky," he'd mutter, pouring himself a drink. At firm dinners, if someone praised me, he would cut in, "Rachel works hard, but don't forget who brought in the client." People would laugh politely, but I could feel the sting behind the words. I tried to smooth over the tension. I told myself it was the pressure of billable hours, the endless grind of the city. I wanted to believe that the man who once held my hand in a library still existed somewhere beneath the bitterness. But the cracks grew wider. Arguments became routine. He started criticizing my clothes, my speaking style in court, even the way I took notes. It was as if every success I earned was an insult to him. The breaking point came on a night I will never forget. We had just returned from a high-profile trial in which I had delivered the closing argument. The jury came back in our favor, and for a brief moment, I felt the old spark of partnership between us. But as soon as we were home, the celebration ended. Victor's voice was sharp, venomous. "Do you even realize how you make me look? Standing there, stealing the spotlight, acting like you're the star of the show? This house doesn't need 2 stars, Rachel. Either you step back or you step out." The words hit me harder than any gavel. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, suitcase half-packed with the essentials I could grab. My hand trembled on the zipper, but my voice was steady when I said, "I won't give up the law. Not for you. Not for anyone." He didn't stop me. He didn't even argue. He simply turned away, as if my absence was a relief. That night, I walked out of the apartment with nothing but my clothes, my law books, and the bitter truth that the man I had once loved had become my greatest obstacle. I told myself one thing as I left. If he was determined to break me, I would rise higher than he could ever imagine. I moved into a tiny apartment on the edge of the city. It had peeling paint, thin walls, and a draft that never seemed to leave in the winter. At night, the sound of sirens became my lullaby. The silence in that apartment was heavier than any courtroom I had ever stood in. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. But loneliness can either bury you or sharpen you. For me, it became fuel. I threw myself into work at the district attorney's office. The hours were brutal. I handled case files stacked taller than my desk, prosecuted low-level felonies, and argued motions in cramped courtrooms that smelled of sweat and coffee. No one was watching, no reporters were writing our names, but every conviction taught me how to stand taller. The pay was modest, and there were nights I went to bed with nothing but instant noodles for dinner. My landlord reminded me more than once that rent was due. Still, I clung to the belief that the law was worth the sacrifice. Not everyone welcomed me. Some senior prosecutors doubted me, assuming my successes at the firm had been handed to me by Victor. I heard the whispers. She won cases because of her husband. But every time I walked into court, I silenced those whispers with facts, with evidence, with cross-examinations that cut through lies like glass. I remember one of my earliest victories vividly. It was a domestic violence case, young woman, barely out of college, testifying against a man who thought no one would believe her. I stood with her, argued her case, and when the guilty verdict was read, I caught the look of relief in her eyes. That moment reminded me why I had chosen this path in the first place. Justice wasn't about glory. It was about giving a voice to those who had none. Each case built my confidence. Judges started to recognize my preparation. Colleagues began to respect my persistence. Slowly, brick by brick, I built a reputation independent of Victor, independent of anyone. The apartment was still small, the nights still long, but I carried a quiet determination with me. I wasn't just surviving. I was building something greater. And deep inside, a quiet vow echoed every time I stood before a jury. One day, the man who tried to break me will see just how unbreakable I am. Opportunity doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes quietly, often disguised as long nights and impossible cases. For me, the turning point came after years of grinding work in the DA's office. I was offered a position as an assistant U.S. attorney. It meant moving into federal court, where the stakes were higher and the defendants more powerful. I accepted without hesitation. Suddenly, I was facing corporate fraud schemes, organized crime families, and politicians who thought the law bent in their favor. Every trial hardened me. I learned to carry myself with calm precision, no matter how intimidating the courtroom. Defense attorneys tried to rattle me. I refused to flinch. Reporters started showing up to hearings, scribbling notes whenever my name was called. I didn't crave the attention, but I understood what it meant. I was no longer invisible. Then came the nomination. The call from the White House still feels unreal in my memory. I was being considered for a seat on the United States District Court. Sitting before the Senate Judiciary Committee, cameras glaring, questions fired like arrows, I held my ground. My confirmation passed, and I raised my hand, swearing an oath not just to interpret the law, but to embody it. Years turned into milestones. From district judge to the Court of Appeals, and then, after decades of persistence and integrity, my name surfaced again. This time for the Supreme Court of the United States. The day I was confirmed as an Associate Justice, I walked out of the Capitol with the weight of history pressing on my shoulders. But the journey didn't stop there. A few years later, when the Chief Justice retired, the President nominated me for the role. I can still feel the tremor in my hand as I placed it on the Bible, swearing in as the Chief Justice of the United States. That night, I stood alone in my chambers, staring at the gavel resting on my desk. I thought of the girl in the library at Harvard, clutching books with trembling fingers. I thought of the woman dragging a suitcase out of her marriage, choosing law over comfort. And I thought of the promise I made to myself: I will rise higher than he can ever imagine. On that night, I realized I had fulfilled it. But what I didn't yet know was that the shadow I had left behind, Victor Hale, was not finished with me. His name was about to return, and this time, not as my partner, but as the accused. While I was climbing step by step through the judiciary, Victor had chosen a different path. At first, I heard his name in passing. He had left the firm where we once worked, started consulting for corporate clients, and was making deals in Washington. To the public, he was a successful lawyer turned lobbyist. But to those who looked closer, the shine was already fading. It started with whispers, money changing hands in back rooms, clients paying for outcomes instead of representation. What I didn't know then, but would learn later, was that Victor had turned the law into a marketplace, and he was selling access at the highest price. The FBI caught the scent when one of his clients, a defense contractor, was accused of hiding safety violations that led to a worker's death. Agent Thomas Reed led the investigation. Phone records, financial transfers, and late-night meetings painted a picture of bribes and cover-ups. One thread pulled another, until the scheme unraveled into a web of fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Sarah Mitchell, a sharp and unyielding federal prosecutor, took the case. She built it brick by brick: wiretaps, bank records, testimony from insiders. By the time the indictment came down, the evidence was overwhelming. I wasn't present for his trial. Ethics demanded I remain far away. But the transcripts crossed my desk like any other case of national interest. Reading them, I could almost hear his voice again. Smooth, practiced, trying to charm the jury like he once tried to charm me. But charm doesn't erase wire transfers. It doesn't silence recorded calls. It doesn't undo forged signatures. In Judge Miller's courtroom, the verdict was swift. The jury found Victor guilty on multiple counts: bribery, fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy to conceal a homicide. When Judge Miller pronounced the sentence, decades in federal prison, Victor's empire collapsed. Reporters filled the headlines. Once prominent lawyer convicted in federal court. Cameras captured him being led out of the courthouse, his shoulders slumped, the confidence that once defined him gone. For most people, that would have been the end of a story. But for Victor, there was still one door left to close: his standing as a member of the Supreme Court bar. And that door, by fate or irony, would open directly before me. The morning of the hearing, the Supreme Court building looked as it always did: majestic, timeless, steady. But for me, the air felt heavier, as if the marble columns themselves were waiting to see how I would carry the weight of this day. The docket was short: just one case, in re Victor Hale. A bar disciplinary proceeding. I had recused myself from his criminal trial, as duty required. But this was different. This was about the integrity of the court itself, about whether a man convicted of corruption could still call himself an officer of the law. And as Chief Justice, it was my responsibility to preside. The clerk, Jennifer Lopez, stood and called the case. The chamber doors opened. Victor walked in, no longer the polished attorney who once commanded rooms. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, his face older than his years. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as the man who had once been my husband, but as what he had become, a man broken by his own choices. He looked up at me. For a brief second, our eyes met. I gave nothing back. The courtroom was not a place for personal history. At the respondents' table sat his defense counsel, Michael Carter, trying to mask the futility of his task. To his left, Sarah Mitchell, the prosecutor who had secured his conviction, sat with quiet confidence. Justice Alan Brooks, seated to my right, leaned slightly forward, his eyes scanning the briefs. The entire bench knew this case was more than just about one man. It was about trust in the legal system. I adjusted the papers before me, my voice calm, steady. This court is convened to determine whether Victor Hale shall remain a member of the Supreme Court Bar following his conviction for bribery, fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Mr. Carter, you may proceed. The defense argued desperation, second chances, rehabilitation. Victor himself spoke, his words practiced, almost pleading. I have paid for my mistakes. Don't strip me of the only identity I have left. When it was time for the court to deliberate, I listened carefully to each justice. Their reasoning was clear. The law demands integrity, and Victor's actions had shattered that trust. Finally, it fell to me to deliver the opinion of the court. I looked directly at Victor as I spoke. The privilege of practicing law before this court is not a shield for corruption. It is a responsibility carried by those who honor their oath. Victor Hale has broken that oath. The court, therefore, orders his permanent disbarment. Effective immediately, he is barred from practicing law in any capacity before this court. The chamber was silent. Victor's shoulders collapsed inward. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, but he did not move. I struck the gavel once, the sound sharp and final. This hearing is adjourned. And just like that, the man who once demanded I choose between my career and my marriage lost the career he had corrupted beyond repair. When the gavel's echo faded, the reporters were already waiting outside. By the time I left the bench, headlines were breaking across every major outlet. Lily Stone, a journalist who had followed the case from the beginning, spoke directly into the camera. In a landmark moment for the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Rachel Anderson has overseen the disbarment of her former husband, Victor Hale, reaffirming the principle that no one, not even those closest to power, is above the law. I walked past the cameras without comment. They saw only the Chief Justice, stoic in her robe, untouchable behind the marble steps. They could not see the tide of memory moving beneath the surface, the girl in Harvard's library, the young wife packing a suitcase, the prosecutor eating noodles in a drafty apartment. That night, in the quiet of my chambers, I sat alone at my desk. The gavel rested near my hand, a symbol of the office I had fought so hard to reach. Beyond the window, Washington was alive with its usual noise, sirens, car horns, the hum of a city that never sleeps. I thought of Victor, not with longing, not even with anger, just with clarity. He had chosen shortcuts, and the shortcuts had led him to ruin. I had chosen the harder path, and it had led me here. For years, I had carried the wound of his betrayal like a shadow. But tonight, I understood something simple. I did not need revenge. I had upheld justice. And sometimes, justice is the sharpest revenge of all. I closed the file on my desk, turned off the lamp, and let the silence settle. Tomorrow, there would be new cases, new questions of law, new voices seeking fairness. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to breathe, not as a survivor, not even as a judge, but simply as Rachel. This was my story, a story where justice became the only answer. If you want to hear more stories like mine, make sure you subscribe to Revenge Repeat, because here, every betrayal finds its ending. Now I want to ask you, if you were in my place, standing as Chief Justice, would you have given Victor mercy? Or would you have handed down the same punishment? Share your answer in the comments below. And don't forget, on Revenge Repeat, the story never truly ends, it repeats.